This is a free recording by Cambridge Khutbas, etc. We hope you enjoy and benefit from the content. Also, please consider donating to the new Cambridge Mosque. Please visit cambridgemosqueismoving.org.uk.
الحمد لله الذي أنزل على عبده الكتاب ولم يجعل له عوجا قيما لينذر بأسا شديدا من لدنه ويبشر المؤمنين الذين يعملون الصالحات أن لهم أجرا حسنا ماكثين فيه أبدا وينذر الذين قالوا اتخذ الله ولدا ما لهم به من علم ولا لآبائهم كبرت كلمة تخرج من أفواههم إن يقولون إلا كذبا وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له له الملك وله الحمد وإليه المصير وأشهد أن سيدنا محمدا عبده ورسوله أرسله الله تعالى بالحق بشيرا ونذيرا بين يدي الساعة من يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز ومن يعصيهما فقد ضل ضلالا بعيدا اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ومولانا وحبيبنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أما بعد فيا أيها الإخوة المؤمنون السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته روى الإمام ابن ماجه عن شداد بن أوس رضي الله عنه أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال إن أخوف ما أخاف على أمتي الرياء والشهوة الخفية. The famous hadith, the Holy Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam says, the thing that I fear most for my ummah is showing off and hidden desire. And the issue of a shirk al-khafi, hidden idolatry, is something that has called forth a mountain of commentary from the ulama. Shirk al-khafi. In another hadith, it's the thing that the Holy Prophet most fears for his community. And the hadith says, الشرك أخفى في أمتي من دبيب النمل على الصخرة الصماء في الليلة الظلماء. Shirk is more hidden in my community than the creeping of an ant on a stone in the middle of the night. Something subtle. And it doesn't refer to obvious shirk, bowing down to images of wood and stone. It's to do with something here that's very subtle. And what that is clear from the context of the hadith, that it is the idol within. Relatively easy to recognize the stupidity and the futility of bowing down to Venus, Mercury, Hubal, Allat, whatever. Much harder to recognize the futility of bowing down to ourselves, the idol within, the nusub, the image, the fetish that we set up in the center of our souls and which we spend much of our lives serving and making sacrifices to. This is a shirk al-khafi, the hidden shirk. And it's to do with the way in which we crave the approval of others a lot of the time. It's to do with the way in which we short-sightedly prioritize our own comforts over what is right and proper and pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is ultimately about dividing our qibla. The qibla is the way which we should be directed, which is the way which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has decreed should be tardaha, you should find in it pleasure and satisfaction, contentment, acceptance. The sound heart is soundly oriented towards the qibla. If there is a sickness, then the qibla may shift until, in the worst scenario, it turns around 180 degrees and it's within ourselves. And sometimes even in the act of prayer, there can be the shirk of the self as well as the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Who's watching me? Will people say something if I'm late? What exactly should I wear? Am I sitting in a way that will convey the right kind of impression? All of those things that filter into the subconscious basement of our minds, these are all ways of dissipating the fullness of our concentration on the qibla. In a famous hadith, حسب ابن آدم من الشر أن يشير الناس إليه بالأصابع. It is a sufficient evil for a man that people should start pointing to him with their fingers. In other words, they see outwardly the signs of success in deen or dunya, and therefore they start to talk. They start to take him seriously. They start to respect him. They start to kiss his hand. They start to do this, that, and the other thing for him. And the Holy Prophet ﷺ, that's enough evil for you to be noticed in that way. Why? Because it's very difficult for us not to take that seriously. It's very difficult for us to have the sufficient inward discipline and focus to reject it and to see it as absurd. And there are complex issues here. For instance, what should be our degree of legitimate self-esteem? We are not required to consider ourselves to be complete worthless worms. And we know this because one of the purposes of Allah's law is that we have a certain hasab, a certain dignity. Karramna bani Adam, we have ennobled the descendants of Adam. We have the right to dignity, one of the fundamental huquq in the Sharia. But where does that sense of our own integrity end as slaves of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, grateful for His blessings, and where does ostentation, riya, desire for shuhra begin? That's where it becomes akhfa, harder to detect than the creeping of a black ant on the rock in the middle of the night. Very difficult to detect, and usually we get it wrong. We err on the wrong side of the balance. There are a number of ways of diagnosing this, and the ulama have stressed here the issue simply of intelligence. The nafs takes its pleasures usually when our minds are not sufficiently focused. Somebody comes up to you and says, I really admire your new car, for instance. If we're completely focusing and paying attention, we'll think, well, yeah, but so what? Many people have new cars and it won't last long, and there's the hire purchase agreement, and it's not really reasonable to respect me more just because I've got the latest model. The mind will quite easily come to that conclusion, but usually the mind is not completely focused. One of the things the nafs likes to do is to make our thinking fuzzy, so that at the lower, more animal level, we're kind of basking in this rather absurd form of praise. So the ulama say the first thing you need to do, if there's a danger that people are starting to respect you in a way that really is starting to inflate you and turn you towards the idol within, is just to think about it. Well, on what basis is it reasonable to respect me more just because I've got a new car? Or if the praise is regarding deen, which is far more subversive, brother, mashallah, you were the last person to finish your sunnah after the Maghrib, and therefore please give me a fatwa, or whatever it might be. Those judgments, people make them all the time because we tend to judge on the basis of what we can see. The danger there is that the ego starts to feel really good. And that's again where the intelligence needs to step in. And you need to accuse yourself, to reckon with yourself, hasibu anfusakum, in that moment, and consider, well, he might have seen that, but he doesn't really know whether I was paying attention or not in the prayer. I might in fact have virtue X, but then I also have vice Y and Z and A and B and C, which he'll never see. It's very easy to do that because we all know that we have those other quieter departments of our lives that are not so picturesque. And we need to get into the habit, almost as a reflex, of thinking about those things when other people show signs of pointing to us, of taking us too seriously. Another thing that the ulama recommend, if we're in that situation, is to remember that people who are, to use the modern term, celebrities, whether it be just somebody who's well known in the neighbourhood or somebody who has 1 million friends on Facebook, whatever it might be, there's all kinds of issues that go with being known. And there is safety in being obscure, in khumul. For a start, people tend to envy those who are famous. If it's in dunya things in particular, but also in deen things, there's a lot of envy and suspiciousness and bad talk and people trying to get their own back and play tricks on you and writing against you and arguments and fitna, and that often outweighs the rather superficial pleasure of persuading yourself that your celebrity is deserved. This is a problem particularly for religious leaders. On the one hand, they need to represent what the religion can do for a human being. On the other hand, they need to remember that everything is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and keeping that consciousness constantly can be a very difficult challenge. Particularly today, since we're in the age of exaggerations and of extravagance. Everything now seems to be over the top. Cultures used to have a certain self-restraint, and people were embarrassed by excessive praise or excessive displays of emotion. People had a natural humility that now seems to have gone out of the window in many cases, and as a result we live in a celebrity culture. Chris Hedges has a new book, The Empire of Illusion. All of his books are worth reading, I think, for Muslims. His book, American Fascists, for instance, on the growth of the American religious right, is very useful. This is one of his newest books, Empire of Illusion, and I think the subtitle is something like The End of Literacy and the Triumph of Spectacle. Because of the mass commercialization of our tendency to zone out in front of screens, most of our traditional akhlaq and adab about humility and decency and modesty have just gone out of the window. Because we're not in a natural majlis-type situation any longer. It's just the flickering screen and the teenager and plenty of time and few boundaries. And increasingly this is taking over our culture. This is the empire of illusion. And a lot of people make a lot of money out of this, because usually our desires, from which people can make billions, are illusory. We don't really need a particular kind of car or a particular sort of product or whatever it might be. But because we have been deluded into thinking that we'll feel really good about ourselves, and other people will treat us as their part-time qibla, if we have those things, we work overtime so that we can afford those things, and the profits go into the pockets of the corporations and the banks. And he blames essentially corporate greed, which he believes is deliberately dumbing people down so that they simply don't think about boundaries any longer. And there's a cult of celebrity, where once there was a desire in culture to see who might actually be worth respecting. In the Middle Ages, in every culture, the people everybody tended to respect and speak of in hushed terms were the saints and the prophets and the genuine religious leaders and the people who were making sacrifices for the community. Now it's not people who are making sacrifices who are the celebrities. Now it's a culture of the pop star, the latest, whatever it might be, sometimes just 15-minute celebrities. Andy Warhol famously said, the nature of the future will be that everybody will be famous for 15 minutes. Nowadays people are famous just for being famous. They spring to stardom having done nothing of any interest. The Jade Goody cult would be one local example, but there's so many others. For what exactly was she famous? Why did so many hundreds of millions of people watch her funeral on TV? What exactly was it about her? She was famous for being famous. Nothing else. Nothing to do with akhlaq, nothing to do with sacrifice, nothing to do with idea, nothing to do with art, beauty, devotion, any of those things that humanity traditionally regarded as the precondition for having people pointing at you. Nothing at all, except that she was famous. And increasingly, this is how people judge even cultural productions. They want to see the new movie because Justin Timberlake is in it, or because it's been well reviewed in the publication that they like. And increasingly, these decisions are being taken out of our hands because of this mad cult of publicity. But the point, the religious point, is that that celebrity culture generally doesn't lead to the sa'ada in either world. Famously, they have problems. The celebrity is either famed for being this kind of idol at the BAFTA Awards, completely immune to any kind of possible criticism, or they crash out and they're doing drug rehab for the 13th time, or their partners have left them, or it's whatever it might be, the Tiger Woods syndrome, and they're famous for being bad. But again, there's no serious evaluation in any case, it's just the kind of spectacle, the triumph of spectacle, as Hedges puts it. And that increasingly is the way our culture seems to be moving. And this whole issue of a shirk al-khafi is the monotheistic answer to that. It's hidden idolatry. Set yourself up as a megastar and certain things will follow. The nafs will become larger and more insecure. The story of Fir'aun is that he's somebody who is arrogant but also insecure. Changes his mind a lot. You can go, but actually he doesn't want you to go. He changes his mind 7 times. This often is the nature of people who are powerful, they're also insecure. Look at the former Prime Minister of Tunisia, now gone into a coma. He realised that actually dunya is not a dar al-baqa at all. It's very temporary. It's a very provisional deal. So how do we get into that state? Well, again, the Imams will say, remember that this is a short-term deal. The one who's praising you for the new car or for whatever it might be, or for something in deen that he thinks you've done, mashallah, brother, you've done Hajj 4 times, and he kind of inflates you. He thinks maybe he's being polite or whatever's going on in his ego. It's not healthy. Remember, in 50 years' time, he's going to be under the ground. You're going to be under the ground. You'll just be names in a book and people's fading memories like all the other people who've come and strutted around and then go into the same hole in the ground. It doesn't last very long. بَلْ تُؤْثِرُونَ الْحَيَاةُ الدُّنْيَا وَالْآخِرَةُ خَيْرٌ وَأَبْقَى. One of the basic points of the Qur'an is you prefer the things of the dunya, but the akhirah is better and it lasts longer. But instead we have to focus on these little things, including what is probably the silliest focus of all. Perhaps you like fast cars, perhaps you like fast women, perhaps you like whatever it might be in dunya, but the silliest thing in dunya is to like yourself, really. Because if you think about it, and you remember your weakness, and you remember how vague and shifting is your consciousness itself, you realize that that's really the last thing that you really want to magnify and worship. That's the thing that religion has come to sort out, to straighten out, so that it can become something that shines in its dark, feral state. It's really not the nicest part of us. Many other things under the skin, stinking. The most stinking thing is the unrestrained human appetite and desire, with its capacity for self-deceit, with its capacity to believe others when they're making fanciful claims about oneself. It's not a nice thing. And its nature is to look for the shadows. Its nature is to avoid truth, reality, the light, and to mess around with the zulumat. On some mental level, it may have the yaqeen that indeed akhirah is better and more lasting, but still it wants to get into all kinds of stuff before it goes and sees that, and that's just not smart. And again here, intelligence is important. To have lub, have intelligence, to have an inward, intuitive ability to think things through in an honest and non-egotistic way is the basis really for the religious life. Inna al-labiba 'inda Allahi bi makan. That the intelligent person has a certain status in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because if we're really dumb, it's hard for us to overcome those inward games that the nafs likes to play with us, and then we're stuck. Intelligence, the greatest gift that we were given, which is why alcohol is a curse, because it interferes with that greatest gift. What distinguishes us from everything else in creation is our ability to restrain ourselves, to know boundaries, to work things out, to go to university, to write books. That's what makes us worthy of some kind of existence in this universe. Alcohol veils that and shuts it off. And this is again part of our ethos that emphasizes the importance of aql. But the most important thing that we can use our aql for is scrutinizing the self, and hopefully we can have fun doing it, because the ego does silly things. It's like a clown. You can laugh at it. It tries to deceive us, but it's not really very good at doing that. Inna kayda shaytani kana da'ifa. The tricks of the devil are weak. They don't really add up to very much, because it's just playing with shadows and illusions. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is khayrul makirin. His plot is the best of plotters. So how can we overcome this thing? One of the policies that the ulama have recommended is that if there's good things, any good things that you do, make sure nobody's around to watch. If you really want to do 6 rak'ahs after Maghrib, 2 in the masjid and 4 after you go home, then they're likely to be more sincere, and there's less possibility of all of the rubbish that goes with shubha, of envy and all of the other stuff. Just keep it quiet. Kun kal usfur bayna tuyur. Be like a sparrow amongst birds. Khumul. Just be obscure. And to the extent that you're kind of not noticeable, it's unlikely that you'll build up this kind of tiresome reputation. And this is a grace that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given to many of his awliya. Many of the hadith scholars in particular, Khalid bin Ma'dan, for instance, كَانَ إِذَا كَثُرَتْ حَلْقَتُهُ قَامَ وَخَرَجْ. He was a hadith scholar, and if too many students were there, he got up and left, because he was afraid of the consequences of having the biggest class in the masjid. He didn't like that. It was preferable for him not to get the reward of teaching hadith than to be possibly exposed to the lethal subversion that is magnifying the qibla within. So sometimes even the ulama will say in some situations you can do things that really make you look like somebody worse than mediocre. One of the pieces of advice they give to a zahid, or real scholar, somebody who's being invited to the court of an amir or a sultan, when you get there, make sure you eat a lot. If you're just picking away a few olives and dates, then that might give the impression that maybe you are some kind of saintly being. When you're there, sit comfortably and really stuff yourself. And that way the sultan won't take you seriously, nobody will take you seriously, and you'll be left, inshallah, in the blessing of obscurity. And in this age in particular, the great ulama and the great scholars and the great awliya and salihin, they're not the celebrities. They're not the ones with 1 million hits on YouTube, Arabic, Turkish, whatever it might be. They're not the megastars. Generally, illa man salim Allah, except for those whom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saves from these dangers, they're the obscure ones. They're the unknown ones. رُبَّ أَشْعَثَ أَغْبَرَ لَا يُشَارُ إِلَيْهِ لَوْ أَقْسَمَ عَلَى اللَّهِ لَأَبَرَّ. Many a person whose hair is a mess and who has dust on his clothes, who nobody points to, were he to swear by Allah's name, Allah would bring about whatever he prays for. That's the reality of religion. And it's difficult, but there is calm and raha in it. What we really crave ultimately is not to be stressed. And celebrity and to be known, to be pointed out, brings a lot of stress with it that overwhelmingly gets in the way of this sa'ada. And ultimately what we require is the pure milk that is dhikrullah. بِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ تَطْمَئِنُّ الْقُلُوبُ. It is through the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that hearts find peace. Not through being talked about, not through having 1 million hits on YouTube. All of that stuff is a misunderstanding of how we actually bring about that inward state that we all crave. So ultimately, again, religion shows itself as being sabila sa'ada. Salvation and happiness really are the same thing, ultimately. The way of calm and balance in dunya, of not paying attention to the attentions of people who are going to be dead in a few years' time, and probably misjudge you anyway. It's just to be calm and to remember that there's only one qibla. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only judge, and that we are ultimately muhasabun, face our reckoning only at his hands, and there won't be anybody else in the tribunal. He will be al-wahid, al-qahar, the one, the overwhelming. It is to him alone that we should give account. And to the extent that we have that certainty, all of this other rubbish will pass away and we won't be tried by it, inshallah. And our prayers facing the qibla will be the sign of how our whole lives are. Lillahi Rabbil Alameen. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us something of this state and not to test us with celebrity, fame, reputation, and all of the other rubbish that disturbs the calm of our hearts. And inshallah to bring us through this dunya in peace and sincerity, inshallah, and to enter us into our graves having a good opinion of him, and with him having a good opinion of us, inshallah. Wa akhiru da'wana and alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. ولي المتقين نكال الظالمين أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله الملك الحق المبين محمد رسول الله صادق الوعد الأمين أوصيكم ونفسي بتقوى الله فإنه خير الزاد وإياكم ومحدثات الأمور فكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار واعلموا أن الله قد أمركم بأمر عظيم أمركم بالصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين فقال جل ثناؤه إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد وبارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد اللهم إنا نسألك رضاك والجنة ونعوذ بك من سخطك والنار ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب ووفق اللهم ولاة أمور المسلمين إلى العمل بكتاب الله وسنة خاتم الأنبياء والمرسلين عباد الله رحمكم الله إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي يعظكم لعلكم تذكرون اذكروا الله العظيم يذكركم وادعوه يستجب لكم ولذكر الله أكبر والله يعلم ما تصنعون وأقم الصلاة